Let's talk about 9 players that you need to be starting in week 14 of fantasy football. As always, we're going to break this up into 3 different categories: your smash starts, your solid starts, and your high risk, high reward starts. 3 categories, 9 total players. Let's start with the high risk, high reward category. First guy up might ruffle a couple feathers, but it's Justin Jefferson for me. I mean, here's the deal. It's been a brutal year for JJ, mainly because of really bad quarterback play. And maybe you're not even in the playoffs because you drafted Jefferson in the first round and he's been a complete bust. But if you're still holding on, if you still have a shot to make it into the playoffs, here's what I always do. I always start my studs, start my star players, even if they've been underperforming, especially in a win or go home for a lot of people, week 14. I would just rather lose with Justin Jefferson in my starting lineup than opposed to Jefferson being on my bench and he goes off and I'll regret it for the rest of my life that I benched my first round pick in such an important game. That's just me. Obviously, if you have a better option, like leave the question down below and maybe you bench JJ. But I do think he's a start this week. I do think he has a squeaky wheel game, if you will. It's just going to be one of those Jefferson games that he goes off. JJ McCarthy likely returns as QB1 coming off that concussion. Obviously, that doesn't excite you, but I think he's a little bit better than Max Brosmer at this point. And if anything, this is more of a start because of the matchup. The matchup is way too good to pass up on against the Washington Commanders, who have allowed the 4th most yards, 6th most fantasy points per game to receivers this season. Again, it just feels like Jefferson's been, all these interviews, the camera's been showing him upset. It just feels like one of those A.J. Brown games where the question, right, is can McCarthy get him the football? If McCarthy can throw it 3 yards and get him on these little slants or these little screen passes, I just think he's going to get targeted a ton early on. It would not shock me if Jefferson puts together a monster performance in week 14 when you need him the most. Again, it's scary. That's why he's in the high risk, high reward category. He very well could bust, but I just think it's going to be one of those weeks where he finally comes through for you. Next guy up on the list is Omarion Hampton, who it looks like he's set to return this week, which would be his first game back since injuring his ankle in week 5. And before Omarion got hurt, it was super unfortunate because he was just starting to heat up. He was just starting to look like he was going to have a huge rookie year. 24.9 fantasy points in week 3, 27.5 fantasy points in week 4. And while we don't really know what the split between Vidal and Hampton is going to look like in Hampton's first game back, but this is another situation where the matchup is just very favorable on Monday Night Football against the Eagles, as Philadelphia over the last 4 weeks is allowing the 3rd most rushing yards per game, 2nd most rush yards on the season, and 9th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. And we all saw it last week on Black Friday when the Eagles faced off against the Bears. They could not stop DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai on the ground, allowing a combined 250 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 39.8 fantasy points. If you want to beat the Eagles, you run the football. Now, I will say, if Justin Herbert, who broke a bone in his non-throwing hand, he had surgery, if he doesn't play on Monday Night Football, then I'm not as excited to start Hampton because the Trey Lance offense scares me, especially in Hampton's first game back. Both of those things combined are not ideal. So I would be more hesitant to start Hampton if Herbert is not out there. But again, drop your question down below and we will figure that out. But if Herbert plays, I think Hampton does have a nice game. All right, let's move on to the solid starts section of the video. First guy up is Quinshon Judkins, who continues to get force-fed the football even when the Browns are trailing, as he's seen 19 plus opportunities in all but 3 games this year since week 3, and has been a little bit more productive over the last 2 weeks since Shedeur Sanders took over as QB1. 15 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games. Even with Sanders under center, opposing defenses still are not respecting the pass. They're stacking the box. Judkins leads the NFL with 8+ defenders in the box on 45% of his runs. No other running back is over 40%. Imagine if Judkins was just on an offense with an above-average quarterback that had some good receivers. Like, this man would be an absolute monster, but that's not the case this year. That all being said, Quinshon, I think, is still a very nice volume play this week, and he still does carry nice touchdown upside when they do get in close. They like to run that wildcat formation with Judkins, which has been very effective as of late. So if that happens, that's great. If he can score a touchdown, you feel good. If he doesn't score a touchdown, then it might not be a good day. But he did see 3 targets in the passing game last week. If that holds up, that could be huge for his overall floor. But this game against the Titans, Vegas has this matchup as by far the lowest projected game total of the season. I don't know if I've ever seen this at 33.5 points. Like, that is insane. Basically, it's just 2 terrible teams going at it, which means it's probably going to be a positive game script for the Browns if I had to guess, because we know Cleveland still has a great defense. I don't think Cam Ward is going to be able to do much on offense. And the Titans have been beatable on the ground as they've allowed the 2nd most rushing touchdowns this season. And let's not forget, they did give up a massive game to Woody Marks in week 4. Yeah, it was a while ago, but Woody Marks, he's been an average player this year. I don't know if he's definitely not a better talent than Judkins, but he went over 100 total yards, 2 touchdowns, and 27.9 fantasy points. I would be starting Judkins with a ton of confidence this week because of the game script, because of the volume that he's seeing, and his touchdown upside. All right, moving on to our next guy, Dalton Kincaid, who's been out for several weeks now dealing with the hamstring injury, hasn't played since week 10, but if he is able to return this week, and it appears he's trending in that direction, we don't know yet for sure, but if he does play in week 14, I think he's going to put up massive numbers, because I'm expecting this game between the Bengals and the Bills to be high scoring, 2 high-powered offenses with 2 elite quarterbacks in Josh Allen and Joe Burrow going at it. Tons of points will be scored. This is a must-win game for both sides. It's an AFC showdown. And we know this Bills offense, especially this passing game, has seemed pretty lost with Kincaid on the sidelines. They need their tight end 1 back, who's essentially their wide receiver 1 in my eyes. Like, this passing attack has been brutal without him. And the matchup against the Bengals doesn't get much easier as they've allowed the most catches, yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points to tight ends this season. It's obviously difficult to trust a player coming off an injury, right? Because you don't know how many snaps they're going to get. But the tight end position has been horrible this year. I think if Kincaid plays, considering the offense that he's on, attached to Josh Allen, the game script, it's going to be high scoring, and the matchup, I think he absolutely needs to be in your tight end 1 spot if he's active. All right, moving on to our next guy, Christian Watson, who, let's face it, has been the focal point of this Green Bay passing attack since star tight end Tucker Kraft tore his ACL. He leads this team in routes, targets, receiving yards, and touchdowns. 80% of the routes run in every game since week 10, 17 targets over the last 2 weeks, and now faces off in a massive division rival game against the Chicago Bears, who are allowing the 4th most yards per target to receivers this season, along with the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the position, and just got shredded by A.J. Brown last week. He went off for 10 receptions, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, 35.2 fantasy points. I think this game could very well be high scoring. Vegas has this point total at 44.5. And it's kind of hard to bench Watson at this point anyways, who's just starting to heat up. I think he has another strong performance in week 14. All right, let's move on to the smash starts section of the video. First guy up is Chase Brown. This one is simple. It's pretty obvious, right? We know Brown has been balling for a while now. 15 plus fantasy points in 5 straight games. 3rd straight 100-yard game, and gets a great matchup against the Buffalo Bills. You know what you can do against the Buffalo defense? You can run all over them, as they are allowing the 3rd most rushing yards and 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. So we know, right? The Bengals are going to go into this game wanting to run the football, and another reason for that is the Bills have been pretty stingy against the pass, as they are allowing the fewest passing yards per game this season. So, yeah, Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, if he plays, Jamar Chase, they're all still going to have nice games. But I do think the running game is going to be the focal point. And while the return of Samaje Perine last week is a little concerning considering the usage, as Perine saw a whopping 41% of the snaps, I believe he had 2 more carries than Chase Brown last week. I'll never understand it. What is this coaching staff doing? Zach Taylor needs to wake up. Like, Chase Brown is just the better all-around back. Feed him. Let Brown get hot. Keep him out on the field. And stop bringing old man Perine onto the field. I don't care if he's 28. He still feels old. He looks old. Like, make Chase Brown your workhorse. It worked last year when you had no other options. Just get Perine off the field. He brings nothing to this offense. I really don't get it. I still do think, though, that Brown is in a smash spot this week. I'm expecting him to have a monster game, and let's say they're in catch-up mode and they need to throw the football. That could be great for Brown, who was heavily involved in the passing game last week. All right, moving on to our next guy, Emeka Egbuka. The fall-off of this talented rookie needs to be studied in a lab, but I do believe there are several factors that have played a role in this. I think part of it is Egbuka getting banged up with that hamstring injury. It took him a couple weeks to kind of round back into form. And Baker Mayfield has also been banged up as of late. He hasn't looked great, which has led to the lowest catchable target rate since week 6. That rhymed. That was not planned. But what's going on with Baker? Like, just get Egbuka the football. And he has not been able to do that. Emeka also running as the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this team with no Mike Evans. Chris Godwin in and out of the lineup has also maybe been an issue because opposing defenses are just really focusing on Egbuka, kind of taking him out of games. But with Chris Godwin starting to round back into form, Bucky Irving returned last week and looked really good. Mike Evans should be back potentially this week or next week. I think things could be looking up, not only for Emeka this week, but for the rest of the year. And since week 7, Emeka is the wide receiver 7 in expected fantasy points at 17.8. I think better days are coming from the rookie. I personally don't think this is the week to bench him. I'm always under the mindset of start your studs, especially in these must-win games. And I think week 14 is the perfect get-right spot against the Saints, who have been very beatable through the air, as they've allowed the second highest completion percentage on passes to perimeter receivers. So I know it's been frustrating. I know it hasn't been great for the rookie, but I would be starting him this week. All right, moving on to our next guy, Brenton Strange. Hopefully you acquired the really talented tight end for cheap over these last couple of weeks, because I do think he's going to explode down the stretch. He has double-digit fantasy points in each of his last 2 games since returning from injury, and has kind of turned into Trevor Lawrence's safety blanket, reliable target over the middle of the field. I think it's pretty clear that TLAW and Strange have a strong connection and rapport. This is a young, talented tight end that I think is really starting to ascend. And I think he's going to go off against this Colts secondary on Sunday, who have allowed the 2nd most yards and 5th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. And we also saw a huge game from Oronde Gadsden in week 7 against this defense. The Colts are also riding a brutal 2-game losing streak, as this offense hasn't looked great as of late. It would not shock me, though, if the Colts get back on track. Maybe it's a big Jonathan Taylor week, which could force Jacksonville to throw the football a ton in week 14. And I think when they do that, Lawrence is looking for Strange early and often. I do think Brenton could finish as a top 4 option at the position this week. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jameson Williams, who, man, since week 9, Jamo is the wide receiver 5 in total fantasy points, and a lot has just fallen his way, right? Sam Laporta, done for the year, opened up more targets for Jamo. Dan Campbell took over play calling, understands how to utilize Williams in this offense. And now Amon-Ra St. Brown injures his ankle, and Jamo goes crazy on Thanksgiving against the Packers, 7 for 144 and a touchdown. Like, you're obviously starting Williams this week. I don't need to tell you that. But what I do want to tell you is I think you can expect another blowout performance against the Dallas Cowboys, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game, 2 receivers, along with the most touchdowns and 3rd most yards. The Lions are playing at home. They're coming off a bad loss. They're inside. They're in a dome. They're going to be angry. I think this game has massive shootout potential. 2 elite offenses going at it. Vegas agrees, as this matchup is the highest point total on the slate at 54.5. I don't think Amon-Ra plays in this one, so it's going to be a lot of Jahmyr Gibbs, a lot of Jameson Williams. Dallas Cowboys don't have a great secondary. So, yeah, Jamo is going to explode in week 14. Hopefully you kept him on your roster, because I think he's going to be a dude, a stud, a potential league winner the rest of the way. That's all I have for you guys today. I really appreciate each and every one of you. Let's close out this year strong. Let's win some leagues. If you ended up enjoying the video, consider leaving a like. comment down below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.